How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boil Eye Hobby Time. It had been a little while since I did a deep clean of my airbrush, so I decided to do that this week before starting my next project, which is actually indirectly how I came up with the idea for this week's project. If you saw the thumbnail or title, you may be wondering how I got from deep cleaning an airbrush to a realistic depiction of Snoopy in a dogfight with the Red Baron. Let me explain. In order to clean my airbrush, I needed to take it apart and give all the parts a bath in isopropyl alcohol. I went to grab some from my dedicated isopropyl alcohol shelf, and I was clean out, which meant I had to run to the store and restock. I hadn't been to the grocery store in about a week, but in that time away, the store had put up all of the Halloween decorations. I hadn't processed how late in the year it already was, so the decorations came as a bit of a surprise. I didn't think much more of it, and I did my shopping. I then purchased my basket full of isopropyl alcohol bottles, and I drove back home. When I got home, I took apart the airbrush, I cleaned it, and I reassembled it. Then I sat down to figure out this week's project. Among all the Halloween things, I saw decorations from the Peanuts Halloween special, and I remembered a little biplane that I was working on that I had put on hold when I did a collaboration with some friends of mine. Because I had the plane, I also felt the Snoopy subplot inspiration, and it's almost Halloween. I decided that a realistic Snoopy versus the Red Baron dogfight was the move. The plane was already assembled, so that meant the next step was to assemble the doghouse. I used some pieces from an HO scale shed that had nice wood grain texture, and for the side walls, I sliced up some styrene and I glued it all together using some plastic cement. After the walls were all together, I took them all apart off camera and trimmed everything down to match the correct angle of the roof. I'd recommend not doing things in this order if you ever attempt this. I used 2 more pieces of styrene to make said roof. While the styrene looks nice and clean, it's far too smooth to look like realistic wood, so I diced up a balsa wood stick until I had enough planks to cover the roof, the siding, and the trim. Once all of the white plastic surfaces had been covered with wood, I used a combination of wire brush and sculpting tool to make the wood look more like wood. I then threw a little hard floor on the doghouse, and it was time to make Snoopy the World War I flying ace. To sculpt him, I used some green stuff. I was thinking of making Snoopy scale accurate to the 1/72 scale biplane, but this is a 6-foot man at that scale. So I decided to kick accuracy to the curb and just make Snoopy Clifford-sized instead. In hindsight, I probably should have used clay instead of green stuff, because green stuff is far more expensive. It also added a lot of extra time to the build because of its long cure time. Clay can just be thrown in the oven for like 20 minutes and then you're good. But that's enough wallowing in the woulda, shoulda, couldas. Let's get back to the build. The green stuff is easy to work with, and after just a few minutes of sculpting, I had a kindergarten art class level Snoopy in pilot attire sitting in mostly the correct position, so I was pretty happy about that. I then set that aside to cure, and it was time to figure out the base. I used a 4x6 gesso board, and I glued a battery housing to the underside. Then I made a pencil sketch of an aerial view of a World War I battlefield, and before I did any painting, I took the figures outside and I primed them. Remember the nice clean airbrush from the beginning of the video? It's time to get it dirty again. The base color that I'll be using for this drab field is Field Drab, which felt appropriate. Back in 2016, I found a channel called The Great War. They covered the events of World War I with a weekly recap of the same week 100 years earlier, along with some specials that covered notable people, battles, technologies, etc. It's a really cool educational resource, and if you're curious about the events during or the events leading up to the Great War, you should definitely go check it out. After wiping up my airbrush overspray, it was time to paint Snoop. There may be some of you out there getting ready to correct my color choice for the doghouse because Snoopy's house is usually shown as red, but in the Halloween special, it's orange. And while this diorama may not be scale accurate, I wanted to make sure that it was Snoopy lore accurate. Speaking of accuracy, this is not actually the Red Baron's famous 3-winged red plane that got him his famous name reputation, nor was he shot down by Charlie Brown's pet dog. But for the sake of a more entertaining diorama, we'll just suspend our disbelief for a minute. After both of the aircrafts and the base had been painted, it was time to figure out the lighting. In order to install my toggle switch, I drilled a hole through the side of the frame using my drill press, and then I used a chisel to gouge out a gap for the large section of the switch to fit into. After screwing the switch in place, I soldered the battery housing to the switch, and I moved on to all the visible elements of the electronics that sit above the base. I drilled a hole in the front of the plane where one of Snoopy's bullets has hit the engine, causing it to explode. I used a Dremel to cause more damage. I then bent and clipped a brass rod, and I soldered one of the filaments to it. I actually broke this particular filament though, so I rethought my approach and embedded the filament deeper in the plane the second time around, which worked out because it made for a far more convincing explosion in the end. I then drilled some small mounting holes into the base to hold the standoffs and run the wires through. The filaments are far too bright to look like convincing machine gun fire, so I covered the back of the filament with a cocktail straw, which I will paint later. I wanted a way to hide the standoffs and wires, and because these two are having a dogfight way up in the sky, I thought clouds would be an acceptable way to do that. I wadded up some polyester fiber fill into cloud-like shapes, and I scorched the little loose ends with a torch. I used an airbrush to add some shading to the underside of the clouds, as well as a subtle gradient to the straw. I painted some bullet holes on the doghouse and added some further damage using this coarse steel wool as metal sparks exploding from the impact point on the plane. I used UV resin to attach the sparks, which added its own subtle element of diffusion as well. The last thing to do was to paint the sides of the diorama black, and after that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.